Welcome to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. Every Wednesday, Mark and Kim, along with their special guests, will explore thought-provoking topics and ideas that promote creativity, self-help, healing, happiness, and well-being to inspire you on your spiritual journey. Each week, Mark and Kim will discuss different paths to achieving a more spiritual, balanced, happy, and healthy lifestyle. Topics will elevate consciousness and range from metaphysics to the human and social experience, and all things spiritual. Welcome to an inspired community that offers support, encouragement, and new ways of thinking. Mark and Kim are tested, certified, and professional spiritual mediums, metaphysical teachers, healers, and spiritual advisors with their own individual spiritual practices in Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, California. You are the inspired and the inspiration.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are at in the world. Thank you for listening in. This is Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio, the voice of consciousness. I am your co-host, Mark Lanehart, the intuitive prospector. And if you're up to explore, discover, or do a little spiritual prospecting for your own spiritual gold, contact me at marklanehart.com or internet search the intuitive prospector here in Seattle. I would love to work with you. And down the coast from me, in the enchanted town of Encino, California, lives a talented, inspiring, and beautiful soul, Kim Thalken, founder of Love First. What say you, Kim?
What a lovely introduction, Mark. Thank you so very much. You put a smile on my face as always. Welcome, inspired listeners. So happy to have you with us here today as we gear up for a beautiful holiday weekend here in the States, Thanksgiving. So much to be grateful for, and I'm so happy to be here. As Mark said, I am in the lovely town of Encino, California. If there's anything that I can do to help support you on your path in the way of readings, healings, hypnotherapy, would love to work with you as well. I can be found at lovefirst.info.
Perfect. And real quick, Kim, let's get into, for our inspired listeners that are listening live right now, how can they interact with us? And if they do miss this live show, how can they find us out on the big wide world web of social media?
Yes, well, we love to hear from our inspired listeners. We are building such a beautiful community on social media, which is where our listeners interact with us. They send us their thoughts, suggested topics that they'd love for us to cover on air, as well as questions for our guests. And you can find us on Facebook under Inspired Living Radio. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram under Inspired for Us. That's Inspired, the number 4 and Us. And also on Google Plus with under Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. So please check us out on social media. Let us know how you're doing. Introduce yourselves. We love to hear from you. And that's how you can find us on social media. If you do miss any one of our live shows, you can also find us on demand on podcasts. The best way to do it would be to go to OMTimes Radio under the archives, and they've got all of our shows from the inception of Inspired Living. So you can listen to every one of our shows that we've ever done, and we hope that that is something that you enjoy.
And also for our listeners, Kim, they can also catch us over on Podbean, SoundCloud, and now YouTube as well. So there's a lot of ways to listen to the encore shows if you do miss the live show. And Kim, keep on inspiring us. What is our positive affirmation for the month of November? It's our last one before we get into December, if you can believe that. December is literally next week.
I can't believe it, Mark. Every time we come up with a new affirmation for the month, it's hard to believe that 4 weeks have gone by.
I know.
But this affirmation, I think, has just been so fitting this month with kind of everything that's going on in our world today. All the stuff that we're hearing about on the news. But then also here in the States, as we look at our upcoming holiday weekend, Thanksgiving, this ties into that as well. And the affirmation is smile and remember that at the end of the day, your blessings outweigh your problems. And isn't that the truth. It really is. When you stop to think about all of the good that's around each and every one of us, um, it really helps to remember that and know that our blessings always outweigh our problems.
Beautiful. And is there any shout outs that you'd like to give for this week? Anybody that you want to give a shout out to any of our inspired listeners? Or
Yeah, actually, this is going to be a personal shout out to my mom. She is
Hi, Mom.
such a hi, Mom. She is such an avid listener of ours. She's a big fan. She's with us every week, and so she's with us today as well. So thank you, Mom, for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the show, and really thank you to all of our inspired listeners. We are so grateful to have you with us. And actually, I'd like to say each and every one of you are a blessing in our lives, right, Mark?
That's right. And thank you. And thank you to your mom for listening in every week. We do appreciate it. I would like to give a shout out real quick and just say a happy and safe Thanksgiving to all of our listeners here in the United States. Be safe out there. And really just enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday. To all of the people that are serving in all the different aspects of military, fire, police, thank you so much for just keeping us safe and protected so we can enjoy the freedoms that we have as far as Thanksgiving here in the United States. And I'm just sending healing, happiness, and health to all of those during this holiday season that might not have a family, might be homeless. Just, sending them a lot of happiness and health during the holiday season, which can be tough for some people.
Love it, Mark. So glad you mentioned that. Yes, everybody who serves us in the armed forces and keep us safe. Thank you very much for your service. And also, I love that you mentioned, too, that while this is a very joyous time of year for people, it can also be a very difficult time of year as well. So to those who are experiencing difficulty, just sending you so much love during this holiday season.
Yeah, this is actually my favorite holiday, Thanksgiving. Out of all the holidays, Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. It's all about food, family, and football. So I'm a very happy man over the next couple of days. So
there you go.
So let's get into. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. No, I was just going to say, I was just going to add to that. I was just kind of looking at the menu for tomorrow and getting excited over here myself.
I'm going to use my psychic senses and just, anticipate that there's going to be turkey on the menu.
Mark, you are good. I tell you what.
I know. So let's get into our topic today, because this is a very interesting topic. And when I was doing the research, when Kim and I were doing the research on this subject, it's a very interesting topic. It can be a very hot topic. And we want to welcome to the show Dr. Suzanne Kelly, who has a new book that is coming out that is called Greening Death. And so today's show and today's topic, we're going to be looking at and talking about the funeral industry and how that impacts our environment. Now, I, for one, know all about death and dying. I've not only had my own near-death experience, but I've buried a lot of family members and a few friends along the way. So I'm very informed about this industry, but I did not think about how it impacts our environment. And so today we're going to be talking all about her new book. She is Suzanne is a green burial advocate and independent scholar, and she weaves together a startling history about how standard American burial practices came to take hold. So I'm going to be interested on the history of this, as far as embalming, encasing the dead in caskets, and then putting them into vaults and then burying them, with all the different wood and metal into the earth. She has standard burial practice harm the environment. Standard burial practice promote by the funeral industry that is over $15 billion in molding American death rights. So that's a big industry, and so we're going to be talking all about that. And she's a first-time guest on Inspired Living, so we would like to bring her on right now and welcome her to the show. Welcome to the show, Suzanne.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure, and thanks for being on. So a very interesting topic, and I'm just curious for you, Suzanne, how did you start even looking at the environmental impacts of the burial industry? How did this even come to light for you?
Well, it was about 15 years ago in 2000. My father actually died, and it wasn't as though I hadn't been exposed to death before. I had grown up in a fairly large, extended Catholic family and had been going to wakes and funerals since before I could remember. But at that time, I was newly immersed in my Ph.D. studies, looking at environmental and feminist philosophies and theories around the body, mostly the female body and nature, looking at both of them as both playground and dump. And suddenly those same questions started to shift to the dead body. What do we think about the dead body? What do we do with the dead body in the U.S. and why? And so I started exploring, the history of our funeral practices, but that sort of didn't satisfy the itch completely. What I also wanted to know was sort of what view of nature would we have to hold to allow these burial practices to take shape in the first place. And then what I really wanted was to sort of join with others who were also thinking about these things.
Interesting. Yeah, it's just something I never really thought about. I too was raised in the Catholic upbringing and confirmed as an adult in Catholicism, and it just seemed like it was just a normal part of the process is to bury somebody and put them in a box and bury them in the ground. But I never really thought about the environmental impact. And some of the studies that you have done. Each year, 20 million board feet of hardwood and 64,000 tons of steel are buried in the form of caskets and grave lining vaults. That's a lot of wood and that's a lot of metal going back into the earth.
Yeah, those statistics come to us from the Green Burial Council, which is a not-for-profit organization that sets standards for the burgeoning green burial movement and for green burial grounds.
Interesting. Yeah, because you say that, iron, lead, copper, zinc, cobalt used in the caskets, and that's all contaminating the soil, obviously.
Yeah, embalming fluid is actually biodegradable, but it is made out of the carcinogen formaldehyde, and we know that poses a threat to worker health.
Interesting. Well, there is the sound of the whistle. We are going to take our first break. We'll be back here in 2 minutes. You are listening to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio, the voice of consciousness. We'll be back in 2.
The best of holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Eros Evolution is where sexuality and spirituality meets. Join me, clinical sexologist Martha Tara Lee, on Eros Evolution on Thursdays, 4 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Are you ready to shift your energy, consciousness, and limiting beliefs? Join me, Shefali Burns, every Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern on Shifting with Shefali here on OMTimes Radio. Shift the blocks, limitations, and negative energies that have kept you from experiencing a life filled with joy, peace, love, abundance, and happiness. Are you ready to shift with Shefali? Are you ready to shine your brilliance?
Free your mind with OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
And welcome back, inspired listeners, to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. As we interview and talk with our special guest today, Suzanne Kelly, Dr. Suzanne Kelly, who is an expert in the environment and more specifically as we take a look at greening death. So before we left for break, we were talking a little bit about how you got into this field. Shall I call you Suzanne or Dr. Kelly?
Suzanne is great.
Okay, because anybody earns a Ph.D., I feel like we need to acknowledge.
Suzanne's great.
Mark, you brought something up that was pretty interesting before we went to break, talking about Catholicism. And aren't there like religious practices that prefer the burial process over other ways of doing this? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's changing though. I mean, they used to also, in Catholicism, they used to believe in purgatory too, the in between of not actually going to heaven after you leave the body. So, they are changing, and some religions do require that you be buried versus being cremated. And I think that's changing though.
Got it. Okay. So, Suzanne, talk to us a little bit about green burial practices.
Yeah. So, as I was saying before about how the conventional practices are polluting, I think that will help to lead in a little bit into what green burial actually is. And so there's sort of the trilogy, right, of conventional burial practices that the green burial movement is largely responding to, and that includes the use of chemical embalming fluid, the use of sealed and treated hardwood and metal caskets, and the use of burial vaults. As I said before, embalming fluid, while it is biodegradable, it is made out of the carcinogen formaldehyde, which we know poses a threat to worker health. So, and there's tons of embalming fluid that's put in the ground every year. And then, as Mark also pointed out, there's tons of hardwoods and metals that are put into the ground every year. And in some studies on the silt loam in cemeteries, it's been shown that there have been elevated levels of things like cobalt and zinc and lead. And then, of course, the burial vault, as most cemeteries actually require. Some people might not even know that there are burial vaults in cemeteries unless you've purchased one. You might not even notice that they're there, because when you get to the funeral, when you get to the cemetery, the casket's usually sort of hovering over the hole, and you may not notice that the vault is already inside. But burial vaults are typically made out of reinforced concrete. They're also sometimes made out of plastic, and they're also sometimes made out of asphalt, which we know is a semi-solid form of petroleum, all which leach into the soil. So those are sort of the three standard conventional practices that green burial is largely in part reacting to. And so green burial, in many ways, it's also green burial is referred to as natural burial. These terms are interchangeable, is really about sort of going back to the old ways, the way that we buried our dead in the U.S. largely over 150 years ago, after colonizers first settled the lands in North America. And it's also the way that people throughout the world who continue to bury largely still bury their dead. And it's the way that some communities in the U.S. have and continue to bury their dead, Muslims and Jews in particular. Although, as I point out in the book, there are examples in the U.S. of cemeteries requiring some sort of a vault or liner, even in Jewish and Muslim cemeteries. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll invert the vault so that the casket actually touches the dirt, so you have that dust-to-dust quality, but on all the other sides, there's actually reinforced concrete. So green burial really is about, returning the body in some kind of a biodegradable container, whether it's a shroud or, a family blanket, whether it's a pine box, a cardboard box. Some people like wicker, something biodegradable in the natural surroundings. I should also say that there are some other goals about in the green burial movement that mark it as more than sort of a return to these dust-to-dust practices. And that includes, this environmental consciousness. 150 years ago, we didn't have, the planet really wasn't on fire, right? We weren't looking for ways to put out, what's happening to the planet right now. So we have like 40 or 50 years of environmental activism behind us. And people are really looking for ways to help nurture the environment and give back to the environment. So that's one thing. The other big part of this, two big pieces, is that 150 years ago, the modern crematory didn't even exist. Open pyre burning has never been practiced with any regularity in the U.S. And so the modern crematory came onto the scene in the late 1800s. It didn't really begin to spark the public imagination until the 1920s. And then it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that it began to take off. Today, cremation rates hover around 50% nationwide. In some states like Washington State, where you are in Seattle, they're about 85%. And it's estimated by the year 2030, if things continue in this path, it'll be at about 70%. So the green burial movement must take account of cremation. And it does, I would say, in the following ways. most green burial grounds do accept interment of cremated remains, or the scattering of cremated remains. And in parts of Europe, they've done a much better job at placing filters on crematories that filter out the byproducts of burning, things like furans and dioxins, and actually mercury from dental fillings, and actually finding more energy efficient ways to fuel our crematories. But we have a long way to go in the U.S., but I would say that that's part of the movement too. And then there's one more piece, and that has to do with the origins of the green burial movement, which can really be found in land conservation. The first green burial ground was started in Westminster, South Carolina in 1998, with the focus of connecting the fact of human death to conserving, preserving, and restoring land.
So, Susan, let's talk a little bit more of the vaults that are built. Like I said, I've been to a lot of funerals, and I've had, one brother that was cremated and another brother that was buried. So I would fall into those stats of that, that 50% here up in Washington State. But I did not know that they actually did a vault below the casket, because you're right. You always see the casket above with a lining around the casket. And I always thought that they were just lowered into the earth and then dirt was put on top of them or onto the casket because even with my brother that was cremated, he was put into a plot that my parents have already established. So you're saying that the concrete is actually like they put either steel or concrete down into the earth and then put the casket in. Am I understanding that correct?
Yeah. So a burial vault is a how many sides are we talking about? 4, 5, 6, a six-sided container, right? So and it's placed within the ground. The hole is dug, and then the vault is placed within the ground. And again, it's made out of either reinforced concrete or plastic or asphalt. There's typically what it's made out of. It's placed within the ground, and then the body is lowered inside the vault. And once the casket is placed inside the vault, the top is placed on top of the vault and sealed up. So it's a completely sealed environment. And then whatever dirt can fit back in the hole now is placed back in the hole. But we don't notice this because
no, not at all.
Right. When we walk up to the cemetery, the casket's sort of hovering over the hole, and the lid has been taken off somewhere else.
I'll be darned. I did not know that. And so these never break down over time then? The vaults never – they're there forever then, I would take it, right?
Well, everything will eventually, yield to the forces of nature. That is certainly true. It's just that it will take a very long time.
But we're talking probably hundreds, if not thousands of years to –
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, would burial at sea be also part of the greening process? Because it was really –
Certainly. There's a book Grave Matters that came out in 2007 by Mark Harris, and he kind of takes the reader through different ways that people are trying to green up their death practices, and ends on the green burial grounds, which were just sort of emerging at that time. And he includes burial at sea there. So yeah, certainly. I mean, returning the body in that way, although I think it's quite expensive to do that, from what I understand.
Yeah, it can be, unless you're, a former military. I was in the Coast Guard for 8 years, and we had a few burials at sea of veterans that had requested to have, versus being buried or being cremated, they had asked that their body be returned to the sea as a sailor. So that's why I was asking. So some interesting stats here about. Let's talk about cremation. Because I'm thinking that cremation is more of a greener alternative, but some of the stats here, just looking through. That let's see here. I just had the stats about driving a certain amount of miles based on what it takes to actually cremate a body here. Incinerating just one body is equivalent of driving 600 miles. How is that? Just based on the chemicals that are being released, or what's the measurement on that?
It has to do on how hot you have to get the crematory in order to burn the body. So crematories are really high burning machines. And so you have to use, generally, a great deal of fossil fuels have to go into actually, fueling these crematories. And that was one of the things I was suggesting before, that in Europe, they're doing a much better job of finding more energy efficient ways, whether it's solar or something else, to actually fuel these crematories so they're not using up, fossil fuels.
Interesting. And then here you said in Minnesota, it's estimated that as much as 3% of the state's airborne mercury comes from crematoriums. So people are breathing this in then. I mean, it's obviously unhealthy for us, and it's unhealthy for the earth.
I know. I think it's not something that we would typically think about, mercury in dental fillings, right? That it would, but when you're cremating that many bodies and you have that many teeth, that it's going to have an impact at some point. Actually, in parts of Europe, they actually remove the teeth that have the fillings in it so as to get around this. But we don't necessarily do this here.
I'll be darned. And so, where do you think it just became more of an industry here in the States, as far as, back you said in the 1920s, we started changing our practices and the history of this. Was there a big push or something that really started, having these, these caskets made and all this process of everything that you're talking about?
Well, yeah, the shift from some sort of informal death care to formalized death care really started in around the 1830s in the U.S. And that's where we begin to see a rise in urban population colliding with new fears around sanitation. There are two twin aims really that have created what we know as the funeral industry today: a focus on sanitation and a focus on preservation. And that focus on sanitation we can see really early, where there were diseases spreading like wildfire through cities. And reformers were trying to find ways to put it out. And so eventually attention came to fall on really these sort of filthy places in the culture, our human waste, garbage, and also, surprisingly, our graveyards.
Interesting. I'm just thinking of places that have a high density of population like New York. I've actually, when I've driven through coming into New York, just the graveyards that are on each side of the freeway. I'm just thinking about how many people are buried there. And
I know which ones you're talking about, Mark. They're like rows and rows,
like miles and miles.
Yeah,
of graveyard.
Yeah.
So
I have relatives buried there.
Oh wow! So sanitation and preservation were the big causes from the history point of what we have today and what we know today as part of our standard process for burying somebody.
Yeah, and the fears around sanitation were really based on erroneous fears around the dead body. So it was believed at that time, because they were trying to figure out how diseases were spreading, it was believed at that time that possibly the smell of things, the stink of things, could actually cause us to get sick and die. So like I said, there was this focus on these sort of stinky, dirty places in the culture, graveyards at that time, church graveyards.
So, Susan, hold that thought. We're going to come back and talk about the fear of the breakdown of the body and all the myths associated with that. Okay. So we're going to be back in 2 minutes. You're listening to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Hey ladies, do you want to have that good hair day feeling all the time? Gentlemen, would you want your special someone to have that glow, letting you know she is feeling completely satisfied? This feeling and that glow can be yours by embracing your sexual power. So join me, Rachel Kenley, award-winning romance author, on the O-Spot. The O-Spot will guide you to that peak with guest interviews, book discussions, and conversations on the thrills of sexual empowerment. Put the zing back in your life. Come up and see me sometime on the O-Spot, live on Hump Day at 10 p.m. Eastern.
Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network. Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Dr. Kevin here, and I want to invite you every Thursday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, to join me on the Dr. Kevin Show, where we have a diversity of guests who help you step outside the box, behind the curtain, and see what a load of crap is going on in the world today, so you have more information with which to make better decisions. We'll see you there. Namaste.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
And welcome back to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim and our special guest, Suzanne Kelly. Thank you for being with us today, Suzanne, as we talk about the environment and greening death. So before we went on break, we were talking about a whole bunch of things. But before we get into the topic of fear of decay and the myths associated with it, I'm just curious, when we talk about using biodegradable caskets, why aren't we doing that today? Is it more costly to do that? Are people not aware of what choices are available to them? Why have we moved away from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I always think about what the founder of the Green Burial Council that I mentioned before, which is this not-for-profit organization that sets standards for the burgeoning green burial industry in terms of green burial grounds. He said that, if it's not on the menu, basically when you walk into a funeral home, then people aren't going to order it. So people are really choosing from their available options. And so when someone dies and you go to a funeral home, and most people will go to a funeral home, although not all states require it, what you're offered are, what we see as sort of the modern casket, which is typically made out of treated hardwoods and or metal. And they're usually, some sort of a sealed sort of a container. And it's sold to the public as kind of a form of preservation, also a kind of a form of protection. So yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. I think one of the reasons why we don't know about these other options is because they haven't been presented to us.
And why would that be? Why would that not be listed on the menu of choices?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the standard American casket, I mean, I can bring you up to date a little bit on how that came to be. Certainly money has a lot to do with it. The modern casket is quite costly. And so, okay, there is the issue of the bottom line. But the modern casket, as we understand it now, grew up as the industry grew up. And that's sort of what we've come to expect and accept as the container that people are buried in, is what we sort of typically have in mind as this modern casket. But we haven't always buried in those containers. And even, again, Jews and Muslims don't bury in those containers. Muslims bury in a shroud and Jews in a pine box typically. And so, there are other examples of communities in the U.S. that do other things, but most of us tend to not think about it. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, that, well, money's always a consideration in so many different aspects of life, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, as we take a look at now, are we starting to see some of the effects of this in the environment already?
The effects of conventional death practices?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think that, some of that we already talked about. Mark pointed out in terms of these statistics, especially when we're talking about the modern crematory and not placing better filters on them and the use of fossil fuels. So yeah, where studies have been done, we do see effects of it, but more studies really need to be done on cemeteries to really show some of these effects. I would say that in my research, there aren't enough studies. I mean, I found some studies that have been done on the silt loam, as I said before, in the cemeteries to see what's leaching in the soil, but more studies would be really helpful.
And more importantly, I'm just wondering what's currently being done to educate people. It must be a difficult topic to educate people on because not too many people want to think about death and dying.
Yeah, I mean, this I sort of get at this. This is sort of the heart of the book. My book really does look at the emerging green burial movement in the U.S., which is a grassroots movement that we're seeing sprouting up in communities large and small across the U.S. This is a people's movement where people are waking up to these polluting and unsustainable death practices, desiring some other way to sort of care for their dead, of being more involved, of going back to these old ways that many green burial advocates refer to to as practices that simply just make sense. Now, as part of that movement, a lot of that focus has really been on education, on consciousness raising. And so I think that, what you see are people like me, Green Barrel advocates in communities, out in the community, giving talks and educating people on what's available to them, what should be available to them, what they could be asking for if they wanted it, and also on these myths that we were getting at before, that sort of these social beliefs around the dead body that keep us from taking on these greener ways of dealing with our dead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's needing to shift a paradigm around that, perhaps. And this would be a great lead-in to talk a little bit about what some of those myths are and the fears associated with the body.
Yeah, as I was saying before, there is this prevailing social belief that the dead body and its attendant decay is a dangerous contaminant that can really cause terrible harm to the living. I know every time I give a talk in any community, the first question I always get after I've gone through the whole talk is, well, can you really just put a body directly into the ground? Won't it contaminate the soil? Won't it contaminate, whatever's going on in the ecology there? And the truth is, no, generally. I mean, there are some cases where bodies are infected with really dangerous viruses, say like Ebola, where the body is actually more infectious after death rather than less, where great care has to be taken with those bodies. Yeah, and even funeral directors, have to be extremely careful, or I don't even know if they're allowed to handle those bodies. But by and large, the dead body does not pose a threat to public health. And even the World Health Organization has been working as recent as the 1980s to get people to understand that in times of natural disaster, it's really best to tend to the living first and then tend to the dead, to not rush to bury the dead. But there has been this tendency to do that for fear that there'll be sort of the second apocalypse, right, after the first one. So that is sort of, I would say, the number one myth. But that is a myth, as I was saying before, that really started to grow up in the early 1800s, where a rise in urban population collided with new fears around sanitation. We had diseases spreading through cities, through towns, through villages. People were trying to figure out how to stop the spread of disease. There was this prevailing social belief, as I said before, that we could get sick by the smell of things. Graveyards were also stinky places, believe it or not. It wasn't a place where actually the living really went to spend time. Sometimes they would actually dig up remains to make room for new bodies. And so eventually people's sites started to focus on these graveyards. And what we started to see around the U.S. were bans in urban areas, in emerging urban areas, in villages, in towns, on burying bodies within those limits. Even in my small town of Rhinebeck, New York, which now has about 10,000 people, and in the mid-1800s, there were about 2,000, there was a ban placed on burial in the village, which still stands today. And what this meant was that these new cemeteries were built on the outskirts of town. This gave rise to what we now understand as the rural cemetery movement in the U.S. These bucolic, natural burial grounds that were really a place where the living were invited to spend time. They were actually the precursor to the parks movement in the U.S. Our first parks were cemeteries. And it was a lot of good really came out of this because people spent time with the dead, but also sort of the natural in nature. But the thing that we forget was that the living went to spend time there because the dead were essentially sent there based upon sort of this erroneous fear that they could cause the living sort of irreparable harm. So that's the beginning.
Interesting. I didn't realize you were up in Rhinebeck. Do you actually teach down at Omega?
I don't teach at Omega, but I've been there many times.
Yeah, I've been there. You should. It's a great place to go and learn about all different subjects, from spirituality to yoga. So yeah, I love Rhinebeck.
I would love to teach something that would be wonderful.
This would be an interesting topic to teach.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, population-wise, 7.3 billion people on the planet. Are we running out of space?
Yeah, that's always a question, right? And it's a question that I think one of the reasons that has sort of driven up cremation rates, right? I mean, the number one reason why cremation rates have started to take off really has to do with money, right? We brought up money before with respect. So that's the number one reason. But there certainly has been some environmental consciousness around cremation that people choose it. And it is, I would say, by and large, as I said at the beginning, considered sort of the second most environmentally sound way of disposing of the dead. If it's less than ideal, it's just because anytime you burn something, you pose a threat to soil, water, and air. And of course, because our crematories in the U.S., don't have these great filters on them, there's that added problem. So where was I? What was the question? I lost track.
Just about space, as far as 7.3 billion people.
The land. Right.
Yeah,
so there's sort of this prevailing belief, sort of save the land for the living, that we shouldn't put the dead into the ground. And I think, one of the things about the green burial movement is that they've really been turning that concept on its head by saying, the dead actually belong to the land as much as the living belong to the land. That there's plenty of space to go around, that there's that this is really about, in the words of Aldo Leopold, who is the so-called father of the U.S. environmental movement, of sort of expanding the parameters of the land community. In some ways, by not continuing to bury our dead green, and by taking on these, as I argue in the book, and taking on these polluting and unsustainable practices, and actually moving away from the land, it's kind of reinforced this idea in many ways that we don't belong to the land, that we have no place in the land. If our death practices can't be connected to the land, then how can we be connected to the land? So, I think that your question is still an important one. I mean, in parts of, to the degree in terms of space, there's lots of space, but, in parts of Europe, like in Germany, for instance, they use recyclable graves, right? So the bodies go in and they're there for a time, and the body decays, and then the bones are left, and then the bones are moved to a common place. That's something that we have not taken on in the U.S. as of yet, although there is one burial ground in Virginia that is allowing what's called recyclable graves. After 75 years, that plot would be renewed, right, for someone else. But it's
interesting. I learned something new every time I do this show. I learn something new, and I did not know that there was actually recyclable graves. I did hear that they were in some places like New York, where space was limited, that they were actually putting vaults on top of vaults, like layering, kind of like a multi-level burial ground. Is there a term for that?
Yeah, I think it's called like double deep, triple deep. That's what we call it in our cemetery here. So yeah, in places where there's a lot of population, they tend to do that. In our cemetery, we only go. They used to do double deep graves, but they just realized that they didn't really need to. And actually, speaking about the level at which you might want to bury a body, this is something that green burial advocates and folks who are creating green burial grounds think a lot about, because the optimum depth at which a body actually will decay more quickly is really around 3 or 4 feet, not the 6 feet or deeper. So if you're putting a body deeper into the ground, the body will be less likely to decompose quickly. It might even actually, petrify in some way, depending upon the conditions.
Interesting. Well, we're going to be heading into our last break, if you can believe it. That's how fast the show goes. But when we come back, we want to keep talking about this. And real quick, after the break, we want to make sure that our inspired listeners can get this new book, Greening Death, and where they can locate you out on the World Wide Web. So we're going to cut to break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. You are listening to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio.
The cutting edge of conscious radio. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
The truth is, you can't change the world if you're broke. I know. I tried. Isn't it time you turned your life's calling into a profitable, freedom-based business? I'm Michelle Barr. Join me every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern for Sacred Success.
Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network. What if business could be fun? What if business is the adventure of living? What are you choosing? Where do you do business that makes it easier, more fun, or more joyful for you? We'd love to see where you do business. Connect with us on Instagram at Joy of Business or Twitter at Joy of Business, and share your pictures with hashtags BusinessDoneWhere and Joy of Business. Let's change the world with business.
Live with medium Lisa Phoenix, Mediumship Messages and Musings, explores mediumship and all things metaphysical. Lisa Phoenix invites you to reach above and beyond your everyday experiences, to explore new dimensions in the spirit world. She will do live readings to connect callers to their loved ones in spirit, shares engaging stories and teachings from her own personal experience, and will have intriguing conversations with other mediums, spiritual teachers, and healers to help you understand the metaphysical world so you can connect to these forces in your day-to-day life. Join your host on this magical and metaphysical journey into the world of spirit every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
Bringing a more conscious lifestyle to your world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
And welcome back to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. Thank you so much to all of our community for being with us today and every Wednesday. We hope that you are enjoying the show and learning something new today. I think, as Mark mentioned earlier, every Wednesday we learn something new, and that is the beauty of our community. We are with our special guest today, Dr. Suzanne Kelly. Thank you so much for being with us. We want to make sure, Suzanne, that our listeners know how to find you, where to find you, and most importantly, where they can buy your book, Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth.
Yeah, so my website is Suzanne M, as in Mary, Kelly, .com. So you can find information on there about me and my book and the speaking engagements I have or book signings, that sort of thing. And of course, you can buy my book straight from the publisher, Rowman and Littlefield. That's probably the most direct way to purchase the book. But the book is also available on Amazon and other online sellers.
Great. So many different ways our listeners can learn more about this topic. And now we're going to be talking about some important additional topics around this as it relates to burial grounds, the differences in them, and also, if we have some time, the history of embalming. But before we do that, I've got to ask this question, Suzanne. I just have to do it. Because as I was reading your bio, you've got a very diverse background in what your areas of expertise are in. And I just have to chuckle as I say this. I'm sure we're going to our listeners are going to perk up when they hear this, that you are an expert in the environment, in how to be more environmentally safe as it relates to our burial practices, in feminism, and also in sex. I had to throw that in there because that's a combination.
Yes, it is. You can't parse those out. Yeah.
No. And how did that happen? And what do you do as an expert in sex? I just have to ask that.
Well, it's more around issues around sexuality. My Ph.D. is largely in women's studies. I taught women's studies for over a decade. And so issues around, gender and sex and the intersections of those were really at the heart of my teaching, at the heart of my scholarship, especially my early scholarship, and at, in the heart of my activism. So that's how it really ties in.
Well, you must have been a lot of people's favorite teacher. All right. Just throwing a little bit of fun in there. So talk to us a little bit about differences in burial grounds and how green burial ground goals may vary.
Yeah. So green burial, it's hard to say exactly how many green burial grounds have emerged in the last decade and a half. There's probably maybe around 120, 130. And I mentioned the Green Burial Council before. They're a great resource if folks want to know more about green burial grounds or find a green burial ground in their area. You can go to their website, greenburialcouncil.org. But the Green Burial Council, as I said before, has been setting standards for the burgeoning industry. And they have three levels of certification, and the bottom level, that's the majority of green burial grounds that we see in the U.S. right now. And if you can imagine simply this, a conventional burial ground of your choice, you sort of conjure up an image of that. And within that burial ground, either a section has kind of been parsed out of it, or individual plots have been made available for dust-to-dust burial. But by and large, while the body's going into the ground in the green way that I've already described, above ground, everything essentially stays the same. In the other two levels, there's a much more of a focus on landscape level conservation and or land conservation. And by landscape level conservation, I mean an attention to what's going on in the ecology above ground. So in terms of soil disturbance, when a hole is dug for a burial, what happens to all the plants that were removed? In our conventional cemeteries, we all have an image of that. These are highly managed, highly manicured cemeteries. In emerging natural burial grounds, they don't necessarily look like that. Like, for instance, our burial ground here in Rhinebeck that we created is actually in a wooded area. It's 2.5 acres of young hardwood forest that's nestled within about 10 acres of woods, and it will remain woods forever. And so when we excavate a site and we do a burial, there's real attention paid to what's happening above ground. We return the plants to the site, and there's also an attention to possibly in the future planting other plants to eradicate the invasive species that want to sort of come in right after the soil's been disturbed. So that's one really big difference. And then the highest tier, the conservation burial grounds, and there are very few of them certified in the U.S., only about 7 or 8. What those folks are really doing is a focus on land conservation. And what this means is that they've partnered up with some sort of a conservation organization, often a land trust, that holds the property in perpetuity. And what this means is it's basically a guarantee to the people buying plots that this land will not only forever be a natural burial ground, but it will forever be a conserved wild space. But again, there are very, very few of those right now. So those are some of the key differences between them if people are looking for a green burial.
Well, and that's good for our listeners to kind of understand the differences and kind of what's happening in that space. Now, as you were talking about embalming, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mentioned before that there were sort of these twin aims that helped to grow what we now know as the American way of death or the American funeral industry that started to take shape in the early 1800s, but didn't really become more formalized until the late 1800s. And while a focus on sanitation was a big part of this, preservation was also another big focus. And where we begin to see that change is actually with the Civil War. During the Civil War, we have all of these soldiers dying far from home in the North, in the South, right? They're coming from they come from the North, they're dying in the South. How do you get these bodies home for burial if you don't preserve them? Now, before this time, even though embalming had been around in one form or another around the world for thousands of years, it had never been practiced in the U.S. It was really kind of seen as a terrible thing to do to the body. But because there were all these soldiers that families wanted burials for, the Union Army brought in new anatomists who were newly trained in this new form of embalming, arterial embalming. They were basically embalming bodies for study. And for those families who could afford it, they paid to have their family members embalmed and shipped back home so that they could be buried. So you would think, though, that embalming would die out then, that it was seen as sort of a temporary solution to a terrible problem, especially because it wasn't done before. And that's actually not what happened at all. And there are really two reasons for that. One is that when Abraham Lincoln died in 1865, his body was embalmed. And interestingly, it was traveled across the country, like through towns and cities, so that people could actually gaze upon it. And they did. They came out to gaze upon his body. And so they could really see this new practice of preservation for themselves. Some historians point to this as a kind of symbolic overcoming his body, sort of an overcoming of a war that had parted a nation. I also talk about it in the book as kind of another overcoming that's beginning to snowball at that time, an overcoming of nature. And then the other piece of this is that the chemical companies that were creating the embalming fluids started to set up workshops in schools to train people in the new practice of embalming. And those folks who had been quasi-undertakers, the people who were transporting the bodies to the graveyard, not the people who were typically caring for the dead, because as I said before, death care work was informal work before this, mostly done by the women of the family or designated women within the community. They were sometimes called shrouding women. But now what happened was that this act of embalming became a scientific practice that became tied to the work of the death care worker, the new funeral worker, the new mortician. And it sort of fell out of the hands of women and was sort of latched on by the hands of men, actually white men in particular. It would take some time for men of color first and then women to enter the ranks of the new funeral directors.
Interesting subject. I just love the history. Yeah, you're right. When Abraham Lincoln passed, he went out on tour after he passed. So
Yeah.
I could totally see the preservation of, the body for people to gaze upon him. Very, very fascinating topic today. And, we're winding down here with the end of the show, but we just wanted to thank you for being a guest. We'd love to bring you back and continue to talk about greening death and how we can, change our views on the death and dying and burial industry. One more time, real quick, for our listeners, how can they locate you and get your book?
Yeah, my website is SuzanneMKelly.com, and my book is available on the publisher website, Rowman and Littlefield website, and also on Amazon and other online sellers.
Perfect. And I'm definitely going to go out and get it. This has definitely been an interesting topic to talk about. Real quick, you were talking about the Civil War, and I remember when we were in Savannah touring the many graveyards that are in Savannah, Georgia, about the South. One of the things that we learned, and some of the terms that we use today, like graveyard shift, a dead ringer, or a wake, is all based on the burial practices, because they were actually burying people alive at such a fast rate of people dying that they actually set up a graveyard shift for people to listen if people were buried alive. So even terms that we use today are all revolving around, burial practice. And we call it a wake because you wait 3 days to see if they're going to wake up.
That's right. That's right.
Just interesting things. And the dead ringer comes from, they would bury people with a string around their finger. And so if there was any movement, that string went up to a bell, and somebody that was doing the graveyard shift would hear the bell and know that they had buried somebody alive, and called them a dead ringer during the graveyard shift. So just very interesting subject. We'll definitely have you back on. Kim, let's have you come back on. I know you want to announce next week's guest. It's going to be a very exciting guest.
Yes, next week we have Laura Day on, who is an author, a speaker, a teacher. She's known for teaching people how to develop their intuition in very practical ways, and practical ways in which we can use our intuition. So you don't want to miss out on this. It's going to be a great show. We'll see you back next week. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
And lots of love to everyone.